The man from the Valdish delegation arrived at the east gate of Harrogate 3 hours before he was expected, and the first thing he did was try to take something that was not his. I was on the gate that morning. My name is Corwin Vale, and I have stood the king's posts for 11 years, and in that time I have learned to read a stranger the way a farmer reads a sky, not by any one thing, but by the weight of the whole. This one came out of a long gray car with the flags of the Valdish Republic on the bonnet, and before his shoes had touched our cobblestones, he had already decided he did not like us. You could see it in the set of his jaw. Some men walk into a place they mean to learn. This one walked into a place he meant to own. He was tall, well-fed, with a heavy gold ring on one hand and a leather folder in the other, and he wore the plain dark suit of a man who wants you to know he could be wearing a uniform if he chose. On his lapel was a small enamel badge, a gray shield with a black key across it, the emblem of the Valdish Bureau, their federal service, the men who answered to no one at home and expected to answer to no one here. His name, I would learn within the hour, was Kessler. Agent Kessler of the Bureau, advanced security for the Valdish state visit, sent ahead to walk our grounds and, as he saw it, to inspect us. He did not present his papers to the gate officer. He walked past the gate officer as if the man were a lamppost, straight up to me where I stood my post at the inner arch, and he stopped a foot from my face, and he snapped his fingers. "You," he said, "bearskin, I need the master key ring for the north wing, hand it over." I said nothing. A guard at his post does not chat, and there was no version of the world in which I was handing a stranger the keys to any part of the king's house. Kessler did not like the silence. I watched it move across his face, surprise first that the lamppost had not answered, and then something harder underneath. He leaned in. He had the kind of breath a man gets from too much coffee and too little sleep, and he used it like a weapon, close and deliberate. "I don't think you understand who I am," he said, quiet now, which is always worse than loud. "I'm advanced security for the Valdish State Party. Your king invited us. That makes me a guest of your crown, which makes your little costume mine to command for the duration. Now, the north wing key ring, I'm not going to ask a third time." He had asked, by my count, twice, and I had not answered either time, and I did not answer now. I stood in the red wool and the tall black bearskin, white-gloved, my rifle grounded at my side, and I looked at a point above his head the way I have looked at that same point through 11 years of weather and 11 years of fools, and I let him find out for himself what he was leaning against. This is the part that men like Kessler never understand until it is too late. They think the stillness is submission. They think a man who does not answer is a man who cannot. They have spent their whole lives in rooms where the loudest voice wins, and they cannot conceive of a discipline that simply outlasts them. That stands where it stands not because it is afraid to move, but because moving is not required. Kessler looked at my silence and read weakness in it, and he did what such men always do with weakness. He pushed. Deaf or just stupid? He reached out with 2 fingers and flicked the brim of my bearskin, hard enough to rock it, hard enough that a lesser-set cap would have tipped. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Back home, a security post that ignored a bureau agent would be cleared out by lunch. Every man on it gone. That's how we run things where I come from. You want to try that game here? You want to find out what happens to a man who obstructs a federal officer of a friendly power? Behind him, the gate officer, a decent young man named Halloran, had gone the color of paper. He knew what I knew, that this was a guest of the state, that the whole visit had been months in the arranging, that the king wanted it to go smoothly, and that laying a hand on a Valdish federal agent on the first morning could sour everything. Halloran took a half-step forward, meaning to smooth it over, meaning to offer the man tea and an escort and a soft word. I moved 2 fingers of my right hand against the stock of my rifle. Down, flat, still. Hold. Halloran stopped. He had served under me long enough to read the signal, and he trusted it, God bless him, more than he trusted his own fear. He stopped and he held, and he let me carry it because he understood even that early, even before any of us knew where the morning was going, that the worst thing we could do was flinch. A flinch is a door. Show a man like Kessler one flinch and he walks straight through it into every room you have. So I gave him no door, I gave him a wall. Kessler stood there a moment longer, and I watched the calculation run behind his eyes. He was not a stupid man. I want to be fair to him, because the truth is the only thing worth writing down. He was a clever man in a narrow way. Clever the way a man is clever who has learned exactly one trick and made a career of it. His trick was intimidation. It had worked on frightened clerks and junior officers and men with mortgages and families all his life, and it had never once failed him, and so he had come to believe it was not a trick at all but a law of nature. Loud men win, frightened men fold. He had built his whole self on that law. And here was a wall that would not fold, and the law was failing in front of witnesses, and he could not bear it. "Fine," he said, stepping back, and he smiled, and I liked the smile less than the snarl. "Fine, play statue. I'll find the keys myself, and I'll be putting your post in my report, obstruction of Allied security first morning. Enjoy your pension while you've got it, bearskin." He turned to Halloran and jabbed the leather folder at him like a blade. You've got a tongue. Walk me to the north wing. Now." Halloran looked at me. It was the right instinct and the wrong one both. He should not have needed my leave, but he was young, and the man in front of him was a storm. I gave him the smallest nod. Not permission to obey Kessler. Permission to go along, to keep the man in sight, to keep him from wandering our house alone. There is a difference, and Halloran caught it. He straightened. "I'll walk you to the steward, sir," he said, careful. "The steward holds the keys and the schedule. Anything you need, he'll see to it properly." I don't want it seen to properly. I want it seen to fast. But Kessler went, because the steward was the next authority up the chain, and even a man like him understood chains, and I watched them cross the courtyard toward the west door with the whole morning already gone wrong. I would like to tell you that was the end of my part in it, that the trouble walked off toward the steward's office and left me to my post and my silence. But I have stood these gates too long to believe that trouble, once it has decided to enjoy itself, walks off after one refusal. Kessler had been embarrassed. He had reached for a lever that had always worked and found it did not, and men like that do not go home and think about why. They go and find a smaller lever, and they pull it harder. I want to stop here before the worst of it and tell you what it costs to stand still, because I think most people who hear a story like this imagine it is easy. They picture the guard as a kind of statue that feels nothing, and they envy him a little, and they miss the whole of it. The whole of it is this: a man who does not move is not a man who does not feel. He is a man who feels everything and has decided, in advance and forever, that his feeling is not the master of his body. When Kessler flicked my bearskin at the gate that first time, hard enough to rock it, there was a thing in me that wanted to break his wrist, and it was not a small thing, and it did not go away because I willed it to. It stayed. It stays in every man who is any good at this work all the time, a live coal held in a bare hand. The discipline is not the absence of the coal. The discipline is the hand that does not open. I have known guardsmen who had no coal at all, placid men, easy men, who stood their posts because it was a wage and a warm coat. And I will tell you they were the worst guards I ever served beside, because the day something truly wanted to come through that gate, they had nothing in them to hold it back with. It is the men with the coal you want. It is the men who feel the whole insult and hold anyway. That is what Kessler was too small to see. He looked at my stillness and thought he was looking at nothing, when he was looking at the hardest thing a man can do, done so well that it looked like ease. So I held the coal and I watched him walk off toward the steward with Halloran trailing behind, and I did not let my breathing change, and no one who looked at me could have told there was a coal at all. That is the trade. That is what the king pays us for, not to feel nothing, to feel everything and let none of it out the wrong door. Young Halloran came back to the gate a few minutes later, having handed Kessler off to the steward's clerk, and he stood a moment in my sightline, and I could see the morning had shaken him. He was of the generation that has never had to hold a coal. Not really, the boarders have been quiet his whole service, and a man like Kessler was new to him, a kind of weather he'd read about and never stood out in. "How do you not answer him?" he said low, not really expecting an answer, the way the young ask the questions that are really confessions. "I wanted to put him through the gate. I've never wanted that with a guest before. Not once. I gave him nothing, because I was on post and he knew better than to expect otherwise. But I marked it, and I resolved to speak to him after, because a young guard who has just discovered his own coal for the first time needs an older one to tell him it is not a sin to feel it, only to let it out the wrong door." He went back to his position at the outer arch, and the courtyard went on shining itself for the visit. And for a little while it was quiet, and I let myself believe, the way you do against all your own experience, that perhaps the man had spent himself and the rest of the day would be ordinary. It was not ordinary. He was back within the hour. By then the courtyard had filled. Word had gone round the household that the Valdish advance party had arrived early and prickly, and the castle had done what a good household does before a state visit. It had begun to shine. Grooms were sweeping the cobbles. A wagon of white flowers had come in from the orchard for the great hall. 2 of my fellow guardsmen had come on to reinforce the ceremonial posts, and there were footmen and maids crossing on their errands. And near the fountain, a knot of the visiting delegation's own junior staff stood in their neat traveling coats, waiting on their principals, watching everything the way careful young people do in a foreign court. That is the detail I want you to hold, because it is the hinge of the whole story, though none of us saw it yet. The Valdish delegation's own people were in that courtyard. Not Kessler's kind, not the bureau, not the swagger, the other kind, the diplomats, the junior secretaries and the protocol officers, and standing a little apart, a slim, silver-haired woman in a dove-gray coat whom I took at first for a senior lady's maid and who was, I would learn, a great deal more than that. They had come early too, these ones, and they had spent the hour doing what Kessler had not. Watching, learning, taking the measure of the house they were guests in. There were 2 Valdish parties in Harrogate that morning, though they wore the same flag. One had come to be honored. The other had come to be feared, and they were about to be forced to choose, in front of everyone, which one they were. Kessler came back across the courtyard with Halloran trailing unhappily behind him and a new heat in his stride. Something had gone wrong at the steward's office. I would hear the details later, that he had demanded the master keys and the full internal security plan of the castle, that the steward, old Ferris Coldwell, had refused him both with the flat courtesy of a man who has refused better men, that Kessler had raised his voice in the steward's own room until Ferris had risen from his chair, and told him quietly that the keys of Harrogate answer to the crown and to no foreign badge, and that if the agent required anything he might request it in writing, and it would be considered. Kessler was not a man accustomed to being told that anything he wanted would be considered. He had walked out of the steward's office humiliated for the 2nd time in an hour, and he had done the thing such men do. He had come looking for the smallest, stillest, most defenseless-seeming target in the yard to make an example of, so that the watching world would see that he was, after all, a man to be feared. He came looking for me. "There he is," Kessler said, loud now, pitched for the courtyard because an audience was the whole point. "The statue, the one who wouldn't give me the keys." He crossed the last of the distance and planted himself in front of my post, and this time he did not lean in and murmur. This time he performed. "Let me explain something to all of you," he called, turning half to the yard, playing to the footmen and the maids and the delegation's junior staff by the fountain, about the difference between a real security service and a costume parade. Where I come from this, he swept a hand at me, at the tunic and the bearskin and the rifle, this is a museum piece, a toy soldier for the tourists. We have men who could walk through 100 of these before breakfast. And do you know why? He stepped in close again. Because our men are allowed to move. This one isn't. This one has been trained like a circus animal to stand still and take it. Watch." And he took the coffee cup from Halloran's hand. Halloran had been carrying it for him, a courtesy the young man was already ashamed of, and he threw the contents at my chest. It was not hot. That is the one mercy I will grant the morning. The coffee had gone cold in the hour of his humiliations, and it struck my tunic cold, a brown stain spreading dark across the red wool, dripping from a brass button. But cold or hot, the meaning was the same, and the whole courtyard understood the meaning. He had thrown filth on the king's uniform in the king's own courtyard, in front of the king's people and his own, to prove that he could, and that nothing would happen to him if he did. I did not move. Not a flicker, not a breath he could see. The coffee ran down my tunic and pooled at my collar, and I looked at the point above his head, and I gave him nothing, because giving him nothing was the whole of my duty, and though he could not have understood it, the whole of my answer. A wall does not argue with the rain. It simply is still there when the rain has spent itself. But something had changed in the courtyard, and I could feel it even without moving my eyes, the way you feel weather change. The footmen had stopped sweeping. The maids had gone still. And by the fountain, the delegation's own junior staff, the neat, careful young people in their traveling coats, had gone very quiet indeed and were no longer watching me. They were watching Kessler. And they were watching, I would realize later, the silver-haired woman in the dove-gray coat, who had not moved and had not spoken, and was watching Kessler with an expression I had no name for yet, but would come to understand very well before the day was out. Kessler saw none of it. Kessler saw only me, and my stillness, and his own reflected triumph. He had thrown coffee on the statue, and the statue had not moved, and to him that was victory, proof of everything he had said, proof that these were toy soldiers and he was a real man, proof that his one trick was, after all, the law of the world. "There," he said softly, and there was that warm and terrible satisfaction in it that I have heard in the voices of cruel men before. "You see, nothing. He'll stand in that stain all day, because that's all he is." He leaned close one last time, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in the enamel badge on his lapel, and he dropped his voice to the register men use when they want to wound and not perform. "You're not a soldier, Bearskin. You're furniture. And when your king and my minister sit down to dinner tonight, I'll be standing behind the chairs where the real security stands, and you'll be out here freezing in your costume, and not one soul in that room will remember your name. Because you don't have one. Furniture doesn't." He straightened, satisfied, and turned to walk away, to leave the field a victor. He got 3 steps. That was when the woman in the dove-gray coat spoke, and the morning turned. "Agent Kessler." She did not raise her voice. That was the thing I noticed first, that she did not need to. She said his name across the courtyard the way you might set a cup down on a hard table, quiet and final, and it carried further than all his performing had. Kessler stopped mid-stride. And the change that came over him when he turned and saw who had spoken told me, before I knew a single fact about her, that this was a woman he had reason to fear. "Madam Secretary," he said. The swagger did not leave him all at once, it drained, the way color drains from a face, in stages. I wasn't aware the principal party had arrived. I was conducting a security assessment of the... "You were throwing coffee on a member of the King's Guard," the woman said. She came forward across the cobbles without any hurry, and the courtyard parted for her without being asked, and I revised every guess I had made about her. She was not a lady's maid. She was not junior anything. She wore the plain dove-gray coat of a woman who has no need to advertise, and she moved through that yard the way old Ferris moves through the castle, as if the ground itself had agreed to answer to her. The junior staff by the fountain had gone rigid at her approach, and one of them, a young man with a leather portfolio, was already moving to her side like a clerk to a judge. I saw it. My staff saw it. The king's people saw it. "You threw coffee on a soldier standing his post in the courtyard of the house we have come to as guests, and you called him furniture." She stopped an arm's length from Kessler, and she looked up at him. She was a full head shorter, and she was not the smaller of the two. Tell me I misunderstood. Tell me you did something else. He obstructed me, Kessler said, and I heard the first crack in him, the whine that comes into a bully's voice when the ground shifts under his one trick. This morning, at the gate, he refused a lawful request from a bureau officer for access to the... He refused to hand the keys of a foreign king's house to a foreign agent. The woman's voice did not rise, but it hardened the way water hardens to ice. Because those are not your keys, Agent Kessler. They were never going to be your keys. There is not a capital on this earth where they would have been your keys. You knew that when you asked. You asked so that you could be refused and be seen to be refused, and have a reason to be angry, because being angry is the only way you know how to be in a room. I have watched you do it for 6 years. I had hoped a state visit might be beyond even your talent for it. I see I was wrong. I stood my post and I did not move, but I was listening now with everything I had, because I understood that something rare was happening in that courtyard. I had braced myself all morning for the ordinary shape of these things. The guest insults the guard, the household smooths it over, the guard endures, and justice, if it comes at all, comes slow and quiet and long after the guest has gone. That is how it usually goes. The powerful are protected by the fear of offending the powerful. Kessler had counted on exactly that. He had counted on the king wanting a smooth visit so badly that no one would ever call the bureau's man to account. What he had not counted on, what none of us had, was that the account would be called by his own side. You misunderstand the situation, Madam Secretary, Kessler tried, drawing himself up, reaching for the badge on his lapel as if it were a shield. The Bureau operates independently of the diplomatic mission. My security assessment authority derives directly from the... Your security assessment authority, the woman said, derives from me, on foreign soil, during a state visit conducted under my mission's flag. That is the law you keep quoting at frightened clerks, Agent Kessler, and you have never once read it to the end. On our own ground you answer to the Bureau. Here, under this flag on this visit, you answer to the head of mission. And I am the head of mission. She let that sit. You have been on Harrogate ground for 2 hours. In that time you have demanded keys you had no right to, threatened a gate officer, been refused by the steward of the household, and assaulted a king's guardsman in front of both delegations. You have made the Valdish Republic look. On the first morning of a visit our two nations spent a year arranging, like a country that sends thugs into the houses of its friends. Now, at last, something entered her voice that was not ice. It was weariness, and under the weariness something close to shame. Do you have any idea what you have done to us? Kessler had no answer. I watched the man who had thrown coffee on my chest stand in the middle of that courtyard and open his mouth and find nothing in it, because the one weapon he had ever carried, the certainty that fear ran downhill and he was always uphill of everyone, had just been taken out of his hands by someone standing higher up the slope than he had ever imagined a person could stand. And then he made the mistake that finished him, though it would take the rest of the day to finish, because a great fall does not land all at once. He got angry at her. With respect, Madam Secretary, he said, and there was no respect in it at all, you weren't here at the gate. You don't know what this man, he flung a hand at me, did. You're a diplomat. You smile and you shake hands and you let people walk all over the Republic because it's polite. Somebody has to do the hard part. Somebody has to make these people take us seriously, and it is never, ever going to be the person in the nice coat who apologizes for everything. He was shouting now, and the shout had a terrible logic to it, the logic of a man burning his own house down to prove he was warm. I did my job. I tested their security and it failed. One of their statues wouldn't so much as move when a hostile agent got within arm's reach of the king's keys. That's a finding. That's a real finding, and I'm putting it in my report. And when the minister reads it, he's going to thank me, because I'm the only one on this trip who remembers that we're not here to make friends. We're here to be respected. The silver-haired woman looked at him for a long moment, and when she answered, she did not answer him. She turned instead to me. "Guardsman," she said, "may I ask your name?" Now a guard at his post does not speak to a guest. That is the discipline, and I have kept it through 11 years and 1,000 provocations, and I would have kept it then. I would have stood silent and let her question fall unanswered, because the rule does not bend for courtesy any more than it bent for Kessler's cruelty. But there is one authority in that courtyard higher than any guest, foreign or domestic, and as it happened, that authority had just arrived. "His name is Corwin Vale," said a voice from the west door. "And you may certainly ask it, Madam Secretary, though I'm afraid he won't answer you while he's on my post. He's very stubborn about it. I've never once persuaded him to break for pleasantries. It's one of the things I value most in him." King Alaric crossed the threshold of the west door and came out into the morning light, and the whole courtyard went down, the footmen, the maids, the grooms, the delegation's junior staff, all of them bowing or curtsying in a spreading wave, all except two. The silver-haired woman, who inclined her head with the exact measured respect of one authority acknowledging another. And me, because a guard at his post does not bow, he holds. And the king has never in his life expected otherwise from me, and would have been troubled if I'd tried. Kessler, I noticed, bowed last and lowest of anyone, and far too deep, the way a man overdoes a thing when he has just understood how much trouble he is in. The king did not look at Kessler at all, not yet. He crossed to where I stood, and he looked at the cold coffee drying dark on the red wool of my tunic, and I watched something move behind his gray eyes that I had seen only a few times in 11 years and never wished to be the cause of. King Alaric is a mild man in his manner and a terrible one underneath, and the terrible thing in him does not shout. It goes quiet. It went quiet now. "Corwin," he said to me gently, "you've a stain on your coat." "Yes, your majesty," I said. It was the first I had spoken all morning, and I said it only because the king himself had addressed me directly, which even the discipline allows. "I have." "Did it get there by accident?" "No, your majesty." "No," the king agreed. "I didn't think so. I was watching from the study window for the last of it. I saw the throw." He turned at last, and he looked at Agent Kessler of the Valdish Bureau, and the courtyard held its breath. "Madam Secretary," the king said, without taking his eyes off Kessler, "I believe you and I are about to have a conversation that neither of us planned to have on the first morning of a visit we both worked very hard to arrange. I'm sorry for it, truly. But I find I cannot let this particular thing pass, and I don't think, watching your face just now, that you can either." "No, your majesty," the woman said quietly, "I cannot." "Then let us do the hard thing properly," said the king, "and not out here where every window in the castle is a spectator." He looked briefly around the courtyard, at the frozen footmen, the wide-eyed maids, the two rigid delegations, and he raised his voice just enough to reach the walls. "This morning's business is finished. The house has work to do and a reception to prepare. Everyone to it, please." And the courtyard began slowly to unfreeze and move. "Agent Kessler," the king went on, and now his voice dropped back down, and it was worse for the dropping, "you will come with us. And you," he said to me, and here the smallest warmth returned to him, "will be relieved of this post for 1/2 hour so that you may put on a clean tunic. Sergeant Halloran will stand it. I'll not have a man of mine wearing another man's contempt on his chest a moment longer than it takes to change coats." "Your majesty," I said, "I'd sooner stand it out if it's all the same. The stain came on duty, it can come off duty." The king looked at me, and a very small, very tired smile touched the corner of his mouth. "You see, Madam Secretary," he said, "stubborn, very well, Corwin, wear it then if you'd rather. Perhaps it's fitting that the whole house should see for 1 more hour exactly what was done here this morning and by whom." He turned. "Come, both of you, to the study." And they went in, the king, and the secretary in her dove-gray coat, and behind them, walking like a man to the gallows and still, God help him, rehearsing his defense under his breath, Agent Kessler of the Bureau, who had come to Harrogate to be feared and was about to learn what it cost. I did not go in with them, of course. I stood my post, in my stained tunic, and I watched the west door close, and I turned my eyes back to the point above the empty air where they have rested for 11 years. But Sergeant Halloran, who had been sent for a clean tunic I would not wear and came back with it over his arm and no one to give it to, stood beside me for a moment before he went to his own post, and he said low, so no one else could hear, "They're going to eat him alive in there, his own people, aren't they?" "I don't know," I said, and it was true, I didn't. I had never in 11 years seen a delegation turn on its own strongman in a foreign court. It is not how the powerful protect themselves. But I think something rare is happening today, Halloran. I think a man reached for the one lever he's used all his life and pulled it, and found it was wired to a trap he built himself. And I think we're about to watch it close. What follows I did not see with my own eyes, because I was on my post the whole of that half hour and the west door does not have ears. But a king's study is a small room, and there was a guardsman inside it, young Bevan, who stood the study door that morning, and who is a friend of mine, and who told me every word before the day was out because he could not have carried it alone if he'd tried. So I set it down as he gave it to me, and I trust it, because Bevan is the sort of man who would rather cut out his tongue than embroider a thing. The study, Bevan said, was quiet when the three of them came in. The king went round behind his desk but did not sit. The secretary stood by the tall window with her hands folded. And Kessler stood in the middle of the carpet where the king had placed him, and he began, at once, to talk. He talked the way a drowning man swims hard, and in every direction and toward nothing. He talked about his authority and his findings and the independence of the Bureau. He talked about the security failures he had uncovered, the guardsman who would not move, the gate officer who had hesitated, the steward who had refused him. He talked about how the Republic was too soft, too eager to please, too willing to be walked on, and how somebody had to be hard so the rest could be gentle, and how the king would surely understand, ruler to ruler, that a nation which does not make itself feared makes itself prey. He talked, Bevan said, for the better part of 5 minutes, and neither the king nor the secretary interrupted him once, and that the silence they let him fill was the most frightening thing in the room, though Kessler was the only one who could not feel it. When at last he ran down, the king spoke first, but he did not speak to Kessler. He spoke to the secretary. "Madam," the king said, "before I say anything, I should like to understand something, because I do not want to do an injustice, even to a man who has just done one to a soldier of mine. You said in the courtyard that you have watched this man do this for 6 years, that he tests and threatens and provokes so that he may be refused and have his anger. Is that a true account? Or was it the heat of the moment?" The secretary was quiet for a breath, and then she told them. Bevan said her voice never rose the whole time, and that was somehow worse than shouting. She had known Kessler, she said, for the length of her diplomatic career. He had begun as a promising young officer of the Bureau, sharp and ambitious, and he had discovered early the thing that so many able men discover and never recover from, that fear works faster than merit. A frightened subordinate gives you what you want at once. An unfrightened one has to be persuaded, and persuasion is slow. So Kessler had built his career on fear. He had learned to find the weakest person in any room and break them in front of the others, because a room that has watched one person break is a room that will obey. It had carried him high. It had also, she said, left a trail behind him a mile wide, clerks who had resigned, junior officers who had asked to be transferred, 3 separate protocol staff who had refused over the years to travel on any mission that included him. She had inherited that trail when she rose to head of mission. She had spent, she said, more hours than she cared to count, cleaning up after the damage his one trick did in rooms where softer instruments would have served the Republic far better. "I have wanted to be rid of him for 4 years, she said. But he is clever, and he is careful with his own kind, and he has never once, in all that time, done a thing so plain and so public that the bureau could not explain it away. He bullies clerks where there are no witnesses. He threatens in corridors. He is very good at leaving no mark that a report can point to. She turned from the window and looked at Kessler, and Bevan said the man actually flinched. And then he came to Harrogate, and on the first morning in a foreign king's courtyard in front of both delegations and the king himself watching from a window, he threw coffee on a soldier and called him furniture. A very small, very cold thing came into her voice. 4 years, Agent Kessler. 4 years you gave me nothing I could use. And this morning you handed me everything, in front of everyone, because a man in a bearskin would not give you the satisfaction of moving. You could not leave one still man alone. And it has cost you the only thing you ever cared about. You can't touch me, Kessler said, but the certainty had gone out of it now, and what was left was thin and frightened, and everyone in the room heard it. The bureau, the minister, the secretary said, is 4 hours behind us on the road, and he will arrive to find that his advanced security officer has created an international incident before the welcome dinner. Do you imagine he will thank you for that? Do you imagine any minister, of any nation, thanks the man who insulted their host's household guard on the first morning of a state visit? You have spent your career believing that the powerful protect their own. And so we do, when protecting our own does not cost us more than it saves. You have just made yourself cost more than you save. That is the whole of it. That is the only law that has ever really run the world, and you never learned it, because you were too busy being feared to notice who was doing the arithmetic. There was a silence then, Bevan said, and into it King Alaric finally spoke to Kessler directly, for the first and only time. I want to be very clear, the king said, about what I am and am not doing here, because it matters, and because I think you have misunderstood everything about this house since the moment you drove through the gate. I am not punishing you for failing to frighten my guard. My guard cannot be frightened. That is not a flaw in your assessment. It is the entire point of him, and if you had understood the first thing about what he is, you would have known that the man who does not move at your worst is exactly the man you want between your minister and a real threat tonight. You looked at the finest soldier in my house and saw furniture. That is not his failure. It is yours, and it is a failure of the eye, and I cannot promote a man's eye by decree. He came round the desk then and stood before Kessler, and he was not a large man, but Bevan said he filled the room. I am also not punishing you on the Republic's behalf. That is the secretary's affair, and she seems to me entirely capable of it. What I am doing, the only thing a king may properly do in his own house, is this. I am telling you that you are not welcome under my roof. You threw contempt on a man who serves me in my courtyard, and there is no apology that unthrows it, and so you will not sleep in this castle, nor eat at my table, nor stand behind any chair at any dinner while my house is your host. You are done here. Whatever becomes of you in the Republic's hands is the Republic's to decide. But Harrogate is closed to you from this hour. My steward will see you to the gate. Kessler looked from the king to the secretary and back, and Bevan said you could watch the last of the swagger die in him, watch him understand, finally and fully, that there was no lever left to pull, no clerk to frighten, no room to break, that he had come to the one place where his single trick was worthless, and had spent it anyway, on a man who could not be moved, in front of the 2 people on earth with the standing to hold him to account. He had built his whole life on the belief that fear ran downhill, and he had climbed, all unknowing, to the very top of the hill, and pulled his lever, and discovered there was nothing below him at all. He did not go quietly. I will not pretend he did, because the truth is the only thing worth setting down. He raged. Bevan said he called the guardsman's silence an insult and the king's ruling an outrage and the secretary a traitor to her own service, and he swore he would have the whole story in the ministry's ear by nightfall and turn to his advantage, and that the king would regret humiliating a bureau man for the sake of a costumed statue. He threatened. He always threatened. It was the only language he had. And the secretary let him finish. And then she said the thing that ended it, and Bevan carried it out to me word for word, and I have never forgotten it. "You keep saying you will tell the ministry," she said. "Agent Kessler, I am the ministry here on this ground under this flag. And I have already decided what the ministry will say." They brought him out through the west door not 20 minutes after they'd taken him in, and I was back at my post by then, in the same stained tunic, because I had refused the clean one and the king had let me have my way. So I saw it. I saw Agent Kessler of the Valdish Bureau come back out into the courtyard he had lorded over that morning, and he was a different shape of man. Not smaller, he was the same tall, heavy figure, but hollowed, somehow, the way a tree is the same size after the lightning as before it, and yet everyone can see it is dead. The steward, old Ferris, walked him to the gate. Behind them came the secretary and 2 of her own junior staff, and this is the part I want you to mark, a knot of the delegation's people who had gathered in the courtyard to watch their strong men leave. They did not gather to mourn him. I understood that as soon as I saw their faces. They gathered the way people gather to watch a long storm finally blow itself out over the horizon. With relief, they were trying to keep off their faces, and not entirely succeeding. Whatever Kessler had believed about the loyalty of his own kind had come to see him go, and there was gladness in them. He stopped in front of my post on the way to the gate. Of course he did. A man like that cannot leave a field without one last word, even a lost field, even a field he has salted himself. "You," he said to me. His voice had gone quiet again, but it was a different quiet now, not the silky menace of the morning, but something cracked and low and almost pleading, though he'd have died before he called it that. "You could have just moved. You understand that. 1 inch. 1 flinch this morning at the gate and none of this happens. I'd have had my little win, I'd have gone on my way, and you'd have kept your quiet post and I'd have kept my—" He stopped. He looked at the badge on his own lapel, the gray shield and the black key, and for one moment something almost human crossed his face, something that knew exactly what it had lost and why. "You didn't have to take all of it from me. You could have given me 1 inch. I looked at the point above his head, where I have looked at 10,000 fools, and I did not answer him, because a guard at his post does not chat, and because there was nothing to say that the morning had not already said better than I could. But I will tell you what I thought, standing there, so you have the whole of it. I thought, you have it exactly backward, and you will never understand how badly. I did not take anything from you. I gave you nothing, and you mistook nothing for weakness, and you spent your whole self trying to conquer it, and a man cannot be robbed by a wall. You threw yourself against the one thing in this house that would not move, again and again, all morning, and you called the bruises my doing. I never lifted a hand. That is the discipline. That is the whole terrible power of it. The still man breaks the storm without ever striking a blow, because the storm breaks itself on him, and then blames the shore." Ferris put a gentle, implacable hand at Kessler's elbow. "The gate, sir," he said, and Kessler let himself be turned and walked the last of the distance to the east gate where his long gray car waited, and got into it and was driven out of Harrogate, and we all thought that it was finished. It was not finished. There was a bad hour still to come, and I want to set it down honestly, because a story where the wicked fall neatly, and at once is a story someone made up. Real justice comes crooked, and it very nearly does not come at all, and this one very nearly did not. Because the minister was still 4 hours behind on the road, and the minister did not know. He arrived at Harrogate a little after 2 in the afternoon, in a convoy of 3 cars with the Valdish flags flying, and he arrived, of course, to a version of events that had been driving toward him for the last 2 hours in the form of Agent Kessler, whose car had met the convoy on the road, and who had climbed in beside his minister and told him, first and fast, and with all the practiced conviction of a man who has lied his way out of trouble his whole life, his own account of the morning. I did not hear that account, but I did not need to. I have known men like Kessler, and I know exactly the story he told. He told the minister that the king's household had insulted the bureau, that a guardsman had obstructed lawful security work and been protected by the king when the agent objected, that the head of mission, his rival, his enemy, the woman in the dove-gray coat, had seized on a trivial incident to settle an old score and destroy a loyal officer of the Republic, humiliating him in front of a foreign king, that the whole thing was a diplomatic disaster manufactured by a soft woman to be rid of the one hard man who kept the Republic respected. He told the minister, in short, that he was the victim. And here is the bad hour, because the minister believed him. At least at first he believed him, or believed enough of it to be angry, which for a proud man on a long road is the same thing. The convoy swept in through the east gate that afternoon, and the minister came out of the lead car with a face like a closing door, and he did not go to the king. He went looking for his own head of mission, and he found her in the great hall where the reception was being prepared, and Bevan, who had followed the whole thing, said the minister rounded on the secretary in front of half the Valdish staff, and demanded to know by what authority she had disgraced a bureau officer, and endangered the entire visit over his word, a servant. For a moment, Halloran had been right and I had been wrong. For a moment it looked as though the powerful would protect their own after all, as though Kessler's one law, fear runs downhill, the strong close ranks, would hold at the very top of the hill where it had seemed to fail, as though the minister would overrule his own secretary, restore the agent, and the whole morning's justice would be undone by an afternoon's anger, and a liar's head start on the road. The secretary did not flinch. Bevan said she stood in the middle of the great hall with the white orchard flowers being arranged behind her and the king's own household frozen at their work, and she let the minister finish, exactly as she had let Kessler finish in the study, and then she said only this: "Minister, before you decide anything, ask the king, not me, not Kessler. The king saw it from his own window. Ask him what he saw, and then tell me I acted wrongly, and I will resign this hour if the king's account differs from mine by a single word." It was, Bevan said, the coolest thing he ever watched a person do, to answer a furious superior not with defense but with an appeal to the one witness who could not be accused of taking sides, because the king had nothing to gain. The king was not Kessler's rival. The king had no old score to settle, no career to protect, no reason on earth to shade the truth. If the king's account matched the secretary's, then Kessler's whole story fell, because a king does not lie to a minister about a thing that happened under his own window in front of 100 people. And the minister, being, whatever else, not a stupid man, understood that, and his anger cooled by exactly the degree that a proud man's anger cools when he begins to suspect he has been made a fool of by the very person he was defending. He turned from the secretary without another word, and he sent to the king's study to ask for a private audience, and the whole castle held its breath a second time that day, because everything, the agent's fate, the secretary's post, the honor of the visit, and though it seems a small thing beside all that, whether a stain on a guardsman's tunic would ever be answered, everything now hung on what one king would say to one minister behind a closed door. I stood my post through the whole of it. That is what we do. The storms come and the storms rage, and the great decide the fates of the small in rooms we are not called into, and we stand our posts and hold, and wait to learn with everyone else what has been decided about us. It is not always a comfortable thing to have your dignity argued over by strangers behind a door you are guarding from the outside, but I had done my duty. I had given the man nothing all morning, and the nothing I had given him had been the truth, and the truth was now in the room with the king, and I found, standing there in my stained coat, that I was not afraid of it. Let them argue. The king had seen the throw with his own eyes, and I have served King Alaric 11 years, and I have never once known him to trade a true thing for a smooth one. The audience between the king and the minister lasted less than a quarter of an hour, and I have it, again, from Bevan, who stood the study door for that too, and who I begin to think was the busiest guardsman in the kingdom that day. The minister came in ready to be angry and ready, Bevan said, to be soothed, hoping, in the way of proud men who have half realized they've been lied to, that the king would give him a reason to keep his anger pointed somewhere comfortable. The king gave him no such thing. He did not rage on his guard's behalf. He did not demand apologies. He simply told the minister, plainly and without heat, exactly what he had watched from his study window that morning. The demand for the keys at the gate, the return, the performance for the courtyard, the coffee thrown on the tunic, the word furniture. He told it the way Ferris tells things, as fact without adornment, the way a man tells the truth when he has no stake in it but the truth itself. And then, Bevan said, the king did a thing the minister did not expect. He did not press his advantage. He said instead, "I tell you this not to condemn your officer, minister, though I have closed my house to him, and that will stand. I tell you because you are about to make a decision about a man's career, and a wise ruler makes such decisions with his own eyes and not another man's tongue. You have heard Agent Kessler's account on the road. Now you have heard mine. They cannot both be true. I make no demand of you at all. I only ask that you decide with the truth in front of you, and then I will abide whatever you decide about your own man, because he is your man and not mine. My only man in this is Corwin Vale, and I have already seen to him." Bevan said the minister was quiet for a long moment, and then he asked the king one question, and it was the question that decided everything. "Your Majesty," the minister said, "this guardsman, when Kessler threw the coffee, what did he do?" "Nothing," said the king. "He did not move. He did not speak. He did not so much as change the direction of his eyes. A man had just poured contempt down the front of his uniform in front of 2 nations, and he stood his post as though nothing had happened, because that is his post, and he does not leave it for the cruelty of fools. That is what your agent called a failure of security. It is, in fact, the most disciplined thing I have seen a man do in 30 years of watching men. Your agent looked at the single steadiest soldier in my house and could not tell the difference between a man who will not be moved and a man who cannot be. That, minister, more than the coffee, is why I would not want him behind your chair tonight. A man who cannot see the difference between discipline and emptiness is a man who cannot see danger coming, because danger, too, holds very still until the moment it strikes." And that, Bevan said, was the moment the minister's face changed for good, because he was a minister of security himself at bottom, whatever the politics of his office, and he understood at once the thing the king had just handed him, that his own advanced security officer had spent the whole morning proving he could not read a soldier, could not tell the steadiest guard in a foreign palace from a piece of furniture, and had staked his judgment, loudly and publicly, on getting it exactly backward. There is no report a man can write that survives that. You cannot lead security if you cannot read a still man. It is the first skill and the last. The minister rose. He thanked the king sincerely, Bevan said, and with something like shame, and he asked, before he left the study, one more thing, whether he might have the king's leave to make the Republic's own response to the morning formally, before the reception that evening, in the king's own hall, in front of both delegations. And the king, who had said all along that Kessler's fate was the Republic's to decide, inclined his head and gave his leave. I did not understand, when word of that reached me at my post, what it meant. I thought perhaps there would be a quiet apology, a diplomat's careful phrase, the sort of thing that is really an agreement to pretend a thing did not happen. I have stood a great many state visits, and that is usually how they mend a tear, with a soft cloth and a hope that no one looks too closely at the seam. I did not expect what came. At 6 o'clock that evening, before the reception began, before the tenants and the craftsmen and the good plain people of the realm had even started to arrive, the whole Valdish delegation assembled in the great hall of Harrogate, the minister, the secretary in her dove-gray coat, the junior staff, all of them, and they asked that the king's household be assembled too. And so we were. The steward and the footmen and the maids and the grooms, and the men of the king's guard who could be spared from their posts, and I among them, in a clean tunic at last, because the king had quietly sent word that this once I might wear the stained one off and the clean one on. And this time I did not argue, because I understood that whatever was about to happen, it was not a thing to stand through wearing another man's contempt. The king sat at the head of the hall. The minister stood before the assembled households, both of them, and he did not speak like a diplomat. He spoke like a soldier, plain and short, and Bevan, standing near, said it was the most honest thing he ever heard a great man say in that hall. "This morning," the minister said, "an officer of my delegation came into this house as a guest, and behaved as no guest should, as, I'm ashamed to say, no officer of the Valdish Republic should ever behave anywhere, and least of all in the house of a friend. He demanded what he had no right to demand. He threatened the servants of this house, and he threw contempt and coffee upon a soldier of the king's guard who had done nothing but stand his post with a discipline that put my officer to shame. He called that soldier furniture." The minister paused, and his jaw worked, and he went on. "I want the whole of both our houses to hear me say this plainly, because a wrong done in the open must be answered in the open, or it festers. That soldier was not furniture. That soldier was the finest thing in this courtyard this morning, and my officer was the worst, and I am sorry. The Republic is sorry. On behalf of my nation and my mission, I ask the king's pardon, and I ask the households, and most of all I ask the pardon of the guardsman himself." And then the minister did the thing I will remember to the end of my life. He turned, and he found me among the assembled guards, and he crossed the hall, a minister of a foreign power, crossing the king's own hall, and he stopped in front of me, and he inclined his head. Not a nod, a bow, small and grave and complete. "Guardsman Vale," he said, "you held your post this morning against a man who did not deserve to breathe the same air as your discipline. You gave him no reaction, and in doing so you showed both our nations exactly what he was and exactly what you were. I have served 40 years, and I have rarely seen its equal. The Republic thanks you, and it is ashamed that you were owed those thanks at all." I did not know what to do. There is no drill for it. A guardsman is trained to stand still through insult, and I could do that in my sleep, but there is no training in the king's guard for standing still while a foreign minister bows to you in the great hall of Harrogate and calls your discipline the finest thing in the courtyard. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I stood at attention, and I held his eyes for one steady breath, and I gave him the smallest inclination of my own head that the discipline allows soldier to soldier, which is a thing that crosses every border there is. And I said, because the king himself had risen, and so the discipline permitted me to speak, the only words I spoke in that whole hall. "The post held, minister, that is all the post held." And the king from the head of the hall said quietly, "Yes, it always does," and that was the end of it. Agent Kessler did not return. He was recalled to the Republic that same evening, Bevan told me, and relieved of his commission within the month, and the secretary in the dove-gray coat, whose name I learned at last was Secretary Vane, which struck me, given my own as a small joke of the world, was confirmed as the sole authority over the delegation's security for the remainder of the visit, which passed from that hour without a single further incident. She came to me herself on the last morning before the convoy left, and she did not bow, she was too senior and too wise for gestures, but she stopped at my post and she said, "Lo, you will never know how many rooms you have made quieter, guardsman, by standing still in one." And then she was gone, and the Valdish flags went out through the east gate, and Harrogate was itself again. I have thought a great deal since about what happened at my post that morning, and about why it turned the way it did, because it does not always. I have stood posts where the cruel guest went home unpunished, and the guard swallowed his contempt, and that was the whole of the story. The world is full of Kesslers, and most of them prosper, and I will not pretend otherwise. What was different that day was not me. I did the same thing I always do. I did nothing. I held. What was different was that this Kessler, in his hunger to be feared, pulled his lever in the one courtyard on earth where two people stood who owed him no fear, a king in his own house, and a secretary who had been waiting 6 years for exactly this. And they did the arithmetic he had never learned to do, and they found him wanting. That is the thing I would have you take from it if you take anything. The still man does not win by striking. He wins by being the wall the storm breaks on, and then by being there, still standing, when the storm has spent itself, and the ones who count come to see what is left. The cruel are not undone by our anger. They are undone by their own certainty that fear is the only law pulled all the way to the top of the hill, where they finally meet someone who is not afraid, and pull the lever one last time, into the empty air. King Alaric said a thing to me, some days after the Valdish party had gone, when he passed my post in the morning and stopped, which he does not often do. He said, "Corwin, do you know why I would not let them undo what happened to you that day, even when it might have been the smoother thing?" And I said, "No, your majesty, I did not." And the king looked out across the courtyard, where the coffee had been thrown and long since scrubbed from the stones, and he said, "Because a house that will not defend the man who cannot defend himself, the man whose whole duty is to stand still and take it, is a house that does not deserve such men, and I mean to deserve mine." He set a hand for a moment on my shoulder, on the red wool that had been stained and was clean again, and he said, "You held your post, Corwin, so I held mine." And he went in. I have kept that, I keep it still. On the mornings when the yard is empty and the storms are far off, I stand my post at the inner arch of the east gate in the red wool and the tall black bearskin, white-gloved, my rifle grounded at my side, and I look at the point above the empty air where I have looked for 11 years, and I am not furniture, and I never was. I am the wall the storms break on, and behind me is a house that will hold its post as long as I hold mine. That is the whole of it. That is the discipline. And it is worth every cold morning it has ever cost me, and it always will be. The post held, that is all the post held.